Good afternoon and a warm welcome to the School of Public Policy and Central European University. My name is Wolfgang Reinecke. I'm the Dean of the School of Public Policy, also known as SPP. And it's of course a great honor to welcome here today our four distinguished keynote speakers, Sheri Berman, who will speak on the first panel, Nadia Urbaniti, Valerie Bunce, and Saskia Sassen, who I'm told is on her way from the airport, who will be on this evening's panels. Also our panelists, my colleagues, fellow faculty, John Chaddock, our rector who just came in. Welcome, John, thank you for coming. All the guests and colleagues and students, of course, a very warm welcome to this conference. It's also a special pleasure to wrap up our academic year at the School of Public Policy with this annual conference. A conference that you saw in the program proposes to discuss a number of very, at least I think, hard questions that democracies around the world are facing today. Is democracy really shunned? Is it increasingly neglected around the world? And if so, how and why and what could be done about that? There's certainly no doubt that in this region, but I think also in Europe and even far beyond Europe, certainly North America, we all were affected by the experiences of 1989 when democracy was celebrated in the streets, in the media, in our homes, everywhere. And with the benefit of hindsight, I guess there was a certain sense of naivete or a foolish sense of inevitability of democracy, a conviction that there is no turn back. And in some quarters, I guess even a certain sense of hubris about this. Is that still the case today? Is democracy a universally accepted, if you will, currency in all political debates around the world? No longer would I say what we increasingly witnessed is a contest over the meaning and the future of democracy, in particular its outcomes and outputs. Not so much its values, I think, but the outcomes and outputs. A contest that is also now global, both in scope, but I think also in its significance. And so this conference is part of a CU-wide initiative that you may have seen called Frontiers of Democracy, launched in the fall of last year under leadership of John Chaddock, and dedicated to discussions and debates over the nature, varieties, and possible outcome of this global contest. And so with this ambition in mind, Frontiers of Democracy initiative takes stock of, if you will, 5 main types of challenges that we are facing today, and there are probably more. First of all, and most obviously, I mentioned this, challenges inside constitutional democracies, challenges, if you will, in the West. Second, as more and more issues require, at least in part, global approaches and solutions, there is a growing realization that global and many regional structures of governance lack any kind of formal, equitable, and accountable structures of participation, deliberation, and implementation. Not the least because crisis management is increasingly becoming the tool of choice, or if you will, no choice. I remind ourselves about the Euro crisis, Ebola, the current refugee crisis in the Mediterranean, and the financial crisis, and many more. Third, Frontiers of Democracy will also look at the rise of new autocracies and the growing contest over the norms of governance, and we have an entire panel devoted to this tomorrow. And yet, while we look at these challenges and notwithstanding them and related to those, we can also observe a counter-trend, if you will, that Frontiers of Democracy will look at. So the fourth theme that we will be looking at is the growing demand for the practice of democracy. I earlier talked about the lack of outcomes, tangible outcomes and outputs. We want more access to decision-making. We want more greater participation. We want more accountability on actual democratic outcomes and deliverables. We are concerned about the fight of corruption and the transparency of tax regimes around the world and so on. So demand for democracy is actually higher than ever. And last and fifth but not least, and related to the above trend, the need to innovate the practice of democracy by experimenting with new forms of democracy, be it through technology, new forms of communication, greater decentralizations, and other means to respond to demands that I just sketched out. And so this conference then is a rare opportunity to debate some, by no means all, of these themes with some of the most prominent thinkers in this field. Before I pass on the word to my colleague, Julia Buxton, to introduce our first speaker in the panel, let me introduce her and thank her for being willing to moderate this entire conference. Julia Buxton is the Associate Dean for Academic Affairs and Programs at SPP. She's a specialist in South America, obviously one of the most fascinating regions for the study of democracy. Julia spent many years studying and advising on the region's rapidly evolving political, economic, and security architectures. And Julia indeed has thematic expertise on democratization and transition processes, post-conflict recovery and conflict analysis, including conflict-sensitive design and policy implementation, as well as gender and gender-sensitive design. Julia, thank you so much for taking us through the conference and pulling together the conversations in our concluding panel tomorrow, all the ideas that we hopefully produce over the next 24 hours. I also want to thank Suzanne and her team for working so very hard over the last weeks for putting this conference together and making it happen. Thank you, Suzanne. Without you and your team, we wouldn't be here today. And hope that all of you can join us for the 5 panels of this event. I'm very much looking forward to reconvene with you all of here tomorrow, as I said already, for the concluding panel. Thank you, Julia, and over to you.
Introduce the first of our panelists, Sheri Berman. I just would also like to add that Julia is also from the United Kingdom, where I was reading this morning, we are the only place other than Iran which has unelected clerics which automatically sit in our legislature, which I think speaks volumes about the nature of what we perceive as being the democratic deficit, not just in East and Central Europe, but also certainly in Western Europe. One of the points I'd also like to make is that the School of Public Policy has been very supportive of the male pledge, the man pledge, which is something that we discussed at the last conference that we hosted with Deepa Nayam, whereby male academics undertake that they will not sit on panels that have no female representation. Now, when we were putting together the speakers for this conference, we looked at those people we would most like to bring here to the School of Public Policy. And it was by a wonderful chance that all 4 of the speakers that we prioritized were all female academics. So I'm very, very pleased that we are hosting a conference where all of our panelists are women. But in order to maintain a gender balance, we have also invited some men who will be serving as discussants. So first of all then, just on our keynote speaker here, on Professor Sheri Berman. Sheri is Professor of Political Science at Barnard College in New York, where her main interests are European politics and political history, democracy, democratization, globalization, and the history of the left. And Sheri is the author of, is the book out now?
Depends which one.
Oh goodness, okay then. Your current book that we have cited here, which is, well, it's not out yet, but we'll be rushing to buy it, Democracy and Dictatorship, Europe from the Ancien Regime to the Collapse of Communism. And Sheri is going to be talking to us about democracy, its strengths, its origins, and its misconceptions. Thank you, Sheri.
Thank you. All right, I'm going to go over. Thank you. It's a real pleasure to be here. I haven't been to Budapest in over 20 years, so I feel like this is a great opportunity for me to learn a little bit more about a part of the world I haven't been able to experience personally for a very long time. So as you know, I'm going to talk to you a little bit today about how to think about the development of democracy. And this is a conference, as you know, more generally themed Democracy Shunned, on the problems and challenges to contemporary democracy. And as Wolfgang said, this sort of reflects, I think, some kind of general pessimism about the state of democracy in the world today. And this pessimism is rooted in some obvious real-world events. We've had a lot of third-wave countries that have swung back from democracy, that have had backsliding, even transitions back to authoritarianism, or to what one of our panels will discuss tomorrow, hybrid regimes, regimes that kind of mix the elements of democracy and authoritarianism. This is, of course, particularly true in the part of the world we are in today, areas that used to be part of the former Soviet Empire. And of course, the most recent disappointment with democracy in this regard comes from the Arab Spring, which, of course, very rapidly turned into the Arab Fall. And so many people are thinking about backsliding, about the problems new democracies have had in stabilizing themselves. And this has led, I think, many people to really question whether many parts of the world are really suited for democracy. To think about whether or not countries actually have the right culture, the right social infrastructure, the right preconditions in general for making democracy work. And I think these kinds of thoughts have even led some people to wonder if it may be the case that some countries are simply not suited for democracy and would be better off under authoritarianism. And I want to say today, or talk to you a little bit about today, about why I think this kind of pessimism is misguided. And I want to talk in particular about two common errors that I think people who make these kinds of arguments or think in this kind of way have about the history of democracy, or about the way democracy actually develops. And the two problems I want to talk to you a little bit about are the sources of democracy's problems, and the second problem, or the second error I'd like to talk to you about, is about what we should legitimately expect from new democracies, particularly democracies that have made transitions for the first time, that is to say, that are trying democracy for the first time in their history. So regarding the first error, I think many people ignore the fact that the problems facing new democracies are inherited rather than the result of democracy itself. People look at things like turmoil, violence, corruption, and they view these things as sort of inherent in democracy, as part of a dysfunctional democratic infrastructure, or as a result of the immaturity or irrationality of particular populations. When in fact, these things are better understood as a legacy of the previous authoritarian regime. Because authoritarian regimes, for example, lack popular legitimacy, they often suppress social cleavages and social problems rather than allowing them to be dealt with. Or even worse, they manipulate or deepen social and often communal cleavages as a way to divide potential opponents or to generate support among favored groups. And so what happens in these kinds of situations is when democratization occurs, these kinds of cleavages, these kinds of divisions often explode, right? And they come into being with democratization, and people tend therefore to associate new democracies with them when they are in fact, again, a consequence of the way dictatorship operates. Authoritarian regimes, of course, suppress opposition and discontent. They block the formation of oppositional institutions and organizations, and therefore, when democratization happens, citizens often express their grievances in very unorganized and chaotic means. You often see, therefore, of course, after democratization occurs, an explosion of different political parties, different political factions, etc. And people, again, tend to associate this with the new democracy itself, this sort of disorganized oppositional behavior, people out on the streets, when again, this is a consequence of the way authoritarian regimes operate. We saw this very, very clearly in the Arab Spring, for instance. The Sadat and Mubarak regimes did not allow the development of real political institutions or truly oppositional political parties. This left religion and religious organizations as the only place in these societies for people to express themselves, for people to come together with their fellow citizens and participate in the lives of their communities. And so it's not surprising, therefore, that when the transition occurred in Egypt, it was Islamist political organizations that sprang to the fore. And the underdevelopment, again, of political and civil society in Egypt before the transition, except for religious organization and groups, also meant, of course, that there was no other groups or organized opposition to the Islamists once the transition occurred, right? So we can understand by looking at the authoritarian regime not only why it was Islamism that became the most important political force after the transition, but also why there were no groups capable of blocking the Islamists and therefore stopping their own potentially authoritarian tendencies. And of course, we could tell the same kind of stories about other Middle East dictatorships under Saddam Hussein's regime. Of course, there was absolutely no political opposition allowed. The regime manipulated and deepened the cleavages in Iraqi society, thereby almost ensuring that when a transition occurred, you would not only have the explosion of differences, but no organized cross-group ways of expressing them. And of course, in a place like Libya, which was ruled under a kind of bizarre personal dictatorship, you had no political institution separate from the dictator himself. There was no attempt to kind of integrate people into any kind of national institutions or organizations separate from the dictatorship, again, thereby making very clear that when the dictatorship disappeared, you would have a political vacuum. And of course, again, in a place like Syria, we see the same kind of situation, right? A regime that was based on the manipulation and deepening of cleavages, thereby, again, ensuring that once it began to slip away, you would have an explosion of these kinds of underlying communal differences. So one error I think a lot of folks make, again, is blaming new democracies for what should really be seen as the pathologies of authoritarian regimes. The second error I'd like to talk to you a little bit about is, I think, the tendency of people to judge new democracies by very flawed historical and comparative standards, right? I think a lot of people base their assessment of what's going on in new democracies on a very idealized view of the way democracy actually develops. And I think this is rooted in a misunderstanding of the way countries that have stable democracy today, Western Europe, for example, North America, about the way democracy actually developed in these places. So if we take a very brief look at history, right, if we look at sort of the collection of sort of stable democracies, let's say in Western Europe, and we think about how they actually developed, I think this might encourage us to think about the state of democracy in other parts of the world today a little differently. And in fact, when I talk to my students about the development of democracy, I often joke with them that I hope that contemporary democracies or new democracies have a much easier job of it than the countries that I actually study, which are those in Western Europe. So when I teach my classes on the development of democracy, of course, I start where democracy began in the modern world, which was the French Revolution. And for those of you who know anything about the French Revolution, you know, of course, that when it happened, this was also heralded as the beginning of a new era, right? Everyone watching the French Revolution and the collapse of the Ancien regime thought, my goodness, this is going to be the start of this great new period in human history, full of freedom, full of new ways of thinking about the organization of politics and society. And of course, this was not the case. And in fact, everyone learned pretty quickly with the French Revolution a larger lesson about democratization, which is getting rid of the old regime is very different than building a new one. So during the French Revolution, of course, you know, as I'm sure all of you are fairly historically minded in this room, that we had several transitions. We got the first transition to what might be called a real democracy in 1793. And this first democracy, of course, collapsed very, very quickly into what became, of course, the modern world's first terroristic regime, which was the Reign of Terror, the main symbol of which became the guillotine, which is not the symbol you necessarily necessarily want your new regime associated with. During this period, about 20 to 40,000 French citizens lost their lives, which of course was a very small fraction of the number of people who actually lost their lives during the period of the French Revolution more generally, which historians estimate to be in the hundreds of thousands. This transition, of course, eventually gave us the first modern dictatorship in the form of Napoleon, and within the space of 10 years after the French Revolution, France had transitioned from the Ancien regime to a constitutional monarchy, to democracy, to the reign of terror, and then to Napoleon. This was not, of course, what most French people had expected or hoped for when the Ancien regime collapsed, and so the transition to the Napoleonic dictatorship was, of course, at the time, quite popular. France's next transition to democracy comes in 1848. This one also fails very quickly. It transitions back within the space of a few years to another Napoleon, which of course gave rise to Marx's great dictum that history repeats itself. The first time is tragedy, the second time is farce. This time the transition in France, of course, brings a wave of democratization to much of the rest of Europe, including the part of Europe that we are in today. All of these transitions fail within the space of a few years. France then makes another transition to democracy in 1871. This is the Third Republic, the third try at democracy. This one is ushered in also by chaos and political violence in the form of the Paris Commune. This transition to democracy, this republic, this third try at democracy, is actually much more successful than the previous ones, but it too is threatened throughout its life by extremists on both the right and the left, and therefore by contemporary standards would probably not be considered truly consolidated or stable. In fact, it's only in the 1950s with the Fifth Republic, the fifth try at democracy, that France really has what we would consider to be a kind of stable democratic regime. So for those of you who have lost count, that is over 150 years since its first transition to democracy. Now, I could tell similar stories, but would probably bore you, about democracy in other parts of Europe. The Italian story is an incredibly tragic one, probably many of you are familiar with. The new state is formed, lacks legitimacy among many of its citizens. This is in the second half of the 19th century. Makes a transition to fairly universal suffrage before the First World War, but collapses soon afterward. You all know, I'm sure, the story of Germany, an even more tragic case whose first try at democracy gives us, within the space of a decade and a half, the rise of the worst totalitarian regime perhaps the world had ever seen. I could tell you, again, similar stories about most Western and Southern European countries, Spain, Austria, Portugal, Greece. They all have very tumultuous, very difficult backstories before they get to a place where we would consider them stable, well-functioning democratic regimes. And if you expand your view outside of Western Europe to some of the more successful third-wave democracies, places like Chile or South Korea or Brazil, and you looked back at their histories, you would also find histories filled with failed democratic experiments, civil wars, violence, things of that nature. So let me just end by giving you what I think are a few lessons that I think a broader comparative or historical perspective on democracy can give us, right? Can teach us about how we might want to look at new democracies today. So the first lesson I think we should take away is that there are many, many paths to democracy, but there are very few paths that are easy, that are quick, and that are not filled with problems and even backsliding. Even if we think about the cases that are often held up by scholars and observers as kind of ideal cases of democratic development, places like England, the UK maybe, if you prefer to think of it broadly, or the United States, if you look back at their histories, you can also see that they had a lot of trouble getting to where, again, they should truly be considered stable, liberal democratic regimes. England starts its path to democracy with a period of civil war and great political violence in the 17th century. And of course, in the United States, we actually have to have the Civil War, which remains by far the bloodiest conflict in our history before we have a government that even ostensibly tries to bring democracy to all of its citizens. And then it takes 100 years from the end of the Civil War before the government actually in any real way gives truly democratic and liberal rights to its citizens. So again, thinking about paths to democracy, while there are many, there are very few that are not filled with problems and difficulties. A second lesson, I don't think we should consider democratic backsliding as precluding future democratic success. In fact, I think if you look at the way democracy actually develops, you often see that backsliding is part of the process by which societies deal with or try to eradicate the legacies of the ancien regime, previous authoritarian regimes, and build up the infrastructure of new ones. It's very difficult to see this at the time, but if we look back, again with a historical lens, we can often see that this is the way in which societies, again, deal with their problems and begin or attempt to overcome them. A third lesson, the problems facing new democracies today are not unique. Again, if you look back historically, you can see that many of the problems that countries are facing today are not unusual, are not unpredictable, and therefore really, when we think about contemporary problems, we should not see them primarily as the result of country-specific factors, something about a particular society, about a particular nation, but again, a kind of result of the inherent difficulty involved in getting rid of the legacies of previous authoritarian regimes and the inherent difficulty of building up the infrastructures of new democratic ones. And again, these infrastructures are not merely political, although that can be difficult enough, right? Building up political parties, building up civil society organizations, but truly well-functioning democracy requires economic and social transformations as well. These take a very long time to actually happen. Fourth, and related to the previous ones, we need to change, I think, our expectations about what kind of progress we can actually expect from new democratic regimes. We cannot expect countries recently transitioned, especially those making transitions for the first time, to look like Sweden or even Italy in the space of 10 years or even a generation. This takes a long, long time. We draw, I think, again from these wrong or unfair or unrealistic expectations, I think the wrong kinds of theoretical and practical conclusions when we look at the experiences that these countries are having today. Again, we have to understand that building stable democracy requires, again, both eradicating previous authoritarian legacies and building up the social, economic, political infrastructure of a democratic regime. These are very difficult things. They are very time-consuming things. But if countries don't start on this process, they're never going to get there. And so while we may bemoan the state of democracy today, I think we have very good reason to see it really as the beginning, right, of what we should understand to be a very long and difficult process, rather than a sign that the country is inherently unable to sustain democracy over the long term. So thank you.
Well, many thanks to Sheri, to Professor Berman. We did actually start surprisingly early for a university conference, so apologies for those who may have missed the beginning of this, but this of course means that we do have more time available for discussion and questions, and Sheri's presentation will also be available on video. The format that we're going to follow up until 3 o'clock is we have our two discussants, Andras Bazocki to my left and my colleague Michael Dorsch to my right, So the format is that each of my colleagues are going to have 10 minutes to explore and raise some of the issues that Sheri has covered. We'll give Sheri the opportunity to come back to some of these points, and then we'll throw this out to broader questions. So first of all, if I just introduce Andras Bozoki, who is a professor in the Department of Political Science here at the Central European University, where his main research interests focus on democratization, political ideas, Central European politics, elites, and the role of intellectuals. And Andras was formerly the president of the Hungarian Political Science Association and a founding editor of the Hungarian Political Science Review. If I can just also quickly introduce Michael while we're on the subject of the introductions. Michael is associate professor in the School of Public Policy here at the Central European University. Michael's an applied economist, and his current research investigates the political economy of development with a particular interest in the economic causes and consequences of political instability, civil conflict, and democratization. So hopefully we have two very appropriate discussants here for the subject material. So if I maybe start over here with you, Andras. Please.
Thank you very much. I would prefer to stand, particularly after lunch, and not because it was boring, it was just quite the contrary. It was an extremely interesting presentation, and thank you for the invitation. I am glad to be here and glad to comment Professor Berman's proposition. So she was discussing the problem of the weaknesses of current or democratic backsliding and weaknesses of some current democracies. And as she argues, this is not so much the fault of the contemporary actors, but we fail to see that it is the real reason of the problems stem from the legacy of the authoritarian regime. That is one point, and the other big point is that we have a very idealized view of democracy, and we should have a more sort of realistic view, and we should get rid of some unrealistic expectations. I think it is true that there is path dependency. It is important geographically, historically, where a country is located. If a country is located in Central Asia, is different from the prospects of democracy from this viewpoint than if it is located in Central Europe or Western Europe. And indeed, it's important to see that democracy is not something which is given. Even if we reached democracy or any country reached the institutional system of democracy, there is no guarantee that it will be easy to be kept. And the recent years show that she is right. It is not a perfect system. It is never completed. So it is an ongoing process. And if I may quote Frederick Douglass, he said famously that if there is no struggle, there is no progress. So she underlines, Sheri Berman underlines the importance of struggle against the backsliding. So what she is saying is something against presentism, against possibilism, that everything is possible. At the early stage of transition, people are absolutely optimistic and they have high expectations about democracy. And we know from the study of revolution that every post-revolutionary situation is about lost illusions. And the growing expectations suddenly end up in a facing backlash. And there is a certain commitment to path dependency, and also important to bring history back. So it's not a clean slate. History has a determining factor. And focusing on the authoritarian past is important, but we have to see which authoritarian past. In more fortunate countries have just only one authoritarian past, other countries have many. But I have also some problems with the presentation and some questions. Professor Berman is focusing on individual countries' histories. Let's take a look on France and its authoritarian past. Take a look on Spain or England for that matter. But the unit of analysis in the path dependency, transition, consolidation, backsliding, it's not necessarily the nation state. It can be the international system. So why not to study not simply the authoritarian past of an individual country, but the past international system. So there is a lack of the international context in this analysis, the dependencies. So, dependency theorists from Gunder Frank argue that, Latin American countries will not go on the same way as United States or England because they are already dependent from the starting point from other core economies which happen to be democratic. So it's not parallel histories of individual nation states, but a complex dependency system which is a global phenomenon. So although it is extremely interesting to study the 19th century pros and cons, democratization waves and de-democratization waves, I think the international system is simply very much different from the 19th century. Immanuel Wallenstein was talking about world system, etc. So I can propose that if we study, for instance, the Arab Spring and the failure of Arab Spring, or if we study the third wave democratization and their problems, we can also say that these are still the products of the Cold War, the products of those bipolar world system. If you think of these North African countries, Tunisia, Algeria was a French colony. They were decolonized, a lot of problems of post-colonial situation. Libya and Syria, Iraq was close to the Soviet Union. Egypt was the strongest ally to the United States. So there was a freezing effect of this. The United States was interested in stability in the Middle East and in the Mediterranean. So they were happy to sponsor Anwar Sadat and Hosni Mubarak, these secular-minded dictators, vis-a-vis more democratic, Islamist, whatever forces. So it is, if you take a look on Egypt, this is not just the history of one particular country, it is a history of the Cold War. United States versus the Soviet Union, a global fight from Chile to Brazil and Iraq. So I think Tida Skacpol mentions in her book, magisterial book on revolution, that there is such thing as word time. That, the time is suddenly gets dense, and sometimes there is a sweeping change. So the speed, the sequence of events might be very different. So it can be an argument against democratization, but can also be an argument in favor of democratization, that maybe the word time is time to time different, and there are particular moments which are favorable for democratization, like the collapse of Soviet Union was such a particular historical moment. And one can even argue that what is going on in Afghanistan and Iraq and even 9/11 was a backlash to the Cold War. I don't want to expand on this, but I am really interested to learn your reaction. And I'm going to conclude now. My other point is that yes, we experience some sort of disappointment with with the current state of arts of democracy, that we were much more hopeful 10 or 20 years ago than today. There is a disappointment, and you suggest that there is a disappointment about the current state of democracy. I would argue that there is not much disappointment about democracy as a normatively good thing, but there is a disappointment about democracy promotion, the possibilities of democracy promotion. At the beginning it looked very easy, democracy assistance, aid, knowledge, exporting that, and then more money, promotion, and then it ended up, installing democracy in non-democratic society, exporting democracy by military force. So these are different stages, and obviously the intervention to Iraq caused a major disappointment in democracy about the future of democracy promotion and possibility. So I wonder how would you reformulate your theory in a situation when it seems that there is a clash between globalization and democracy. Democracy is a small-scale issue, a nation-state issue, constituency and elected officials. In the meantime, there is a globalized world which did not exist in the 19th century. For instance, you can rightly argue that it's wrong to take the Western European experience because Eastern Europe is very much different, but still we are in the same continental union, the European Union. We have the same founding document, the Lisbon Treaty, and the same expectations from all member states. So it's interesting to have the same expectation from very different countries with very, very different historical background, but this is a situation, so there is a sort of homogenization impact of globalization, and I would love to learn your reaction to these things. Thank you very much.
Many thanks, András, and the points you raise are very much some of the points I would have also raised, particularly in relation to democracy promotion. But before we give Professor Berman the chance to reformulate her theory with those comments in mind, I would like to hand over to Michael, because Professor Berman would rather take the two sets of comments first.
Okay, that's fine. So in my reading of some of Professor Berman's work and in her presentation today, one message that comes through is that political transitions seem to be actually quite frequent events, but actual consolidations of democracy tend to be far more rare events. So I would really like to, I guess, pose a series of questions concerning the consolidation of democracy with reference to some of the historical experiences that Professor Berman has studied. So I think my first series of questions concerns the role of sovereign debt in the consolidation of democracy. So you discussed today the French historical experience. You didn't have time to discuss kind of the German historical experience, but as an economist, one of the most interesting, I guess, aspects of the German interwar experience has to do with the sovereign debt that the state incurred and really was unable in any realistic sense to pay back. So this kind of, I guess, default on their debt triggered tremendous economic difficulties in the country, which many economic and political historians have argued has kind of catalyzed their backslide from democracy. So I guess the question that I would like to ask is the relevance to today's situation with the Greeks. Certainly there's some irony in the comparison that I would be curious to hear your reflections on. And second, I would like to hear your reflections on the role of the international community for democratic consolidation, specifically as it regards problems with sovereign debt. The extent to which debt forgiveness, fiscal stabilization are relevant strategies for the international community to follow in its pursuit of democratic expansion. Or, put it another way, support of democratic consolidation. So perhaps relatedly, many political liberalizations are accompanied by economic liberalizations. So I'm wondering what, if any, in your reading of history, does economic liberalization play in democratic consolidation? Empirically speaking, one of the most robust predictors of democratic consolidation is post-transition economic growth, empirically speaking. So to the extent that there is a relationship between liberalization of economic institutions and economic growth, I would like to hear your comments on that. I mean, I don't really think it's so straightforward that economic liberalization is correlated with economic growth and economic growth is correlated with consolidation of democracy. I think there's probably something more subtle going on in the changing power structures of society following an economic liberalization that is what allows for the democratic consolidation. But the economists have not gotten into that level of nuance, regrettably, in their estimations. Yeah, so next, the historical examples in much of your research, the French example, the Italian example, the German example, these took long times. It took a long time in each of these examples for democracy to be consolidated. Kind of an obvious question for me is, does democratic consolidation take as long in the modern era? Is there anything about the modern era which allows for democratic consolidation to happen faster? Countries have examples of good political institutions that are out there. Countries, new democracies, have democratic peers and support for consolidating their democracies. So, I mean, do we expect to have to wait 150 years for the Arab Spring to be consolidated? Or is there something about the modern era that will allow it to go faster, including modern political communication, modern communication, which might expedite the political development process? Finally, maybe there's a great quote in one of your articles, and I'll kind of jump to the chase, cut to the chase on this. So with reference to critics of the Arab Spring, it's noted that in fact stable liberal democracy usually emerges only at the end of long, often violent struggles with many twists, turns, false starts, and detours. And a lot of your talk has to do with, it's a mistake to think that what we consider today to be consolidated democracies have always been such. So I might ask if you would like to perhaps give the audience, give the participants an example that might surprise them of a state which is commonly perceived to be a consolidated democracy, but seems to have, or in your opinion, may have some twists, turns, false starts, and detours yet to come. Thanks.
Well, thank you both for those great comments and questions. I will try to do my best to address at least some of them. So let me begin with questions about regional and international influences. This is obviously incredibly important in determining the kinds of challenges different countries face and the types of opportunities different countries have to consolidate new democratic regimes. Regional influences, it's hard to ignore their importance in a place like Hungary, where we are today. Obviously, the European Union played an incredibly important role, not so much directly in the transitions, but certainly in the post-transition phase, right, in providing incentives for different countries to speed up, for better or worse, their processes of political and economic transition. This made a huge difference in what happened particularly in those countries that ended up joining the European Union. So yes, obviously we need to think very carefully about regional and international influences. They also help to set the norms for particular times. And in that way, in fact, I would say we should be more rather than less optimistic about the contemporary era. It's really only in the second half of the 20th century, and in particular by the end of the 20th century, that democracy became the kind of default governing norm for much of the world. This was not true before then. We had a variety of competitors to democracy, traditional dictatorships, monarchism, fascism, communism. Today, really the only thing that could be seen as a competitor would be some form of undemocratic Islamism, and the appeal of this is obviously fairly limited. So even where you have backsliding hybrid regimes today, they're not presented as real sort of alternatives to democracy, and therefore their bases for legitimacy are really much weaker than what you would have seen in what you would think of as hybrid or dictatorial regimes in the past. And I think that that actually will make a huge difference both in the way these regimes act and in the longevity of these regimes over the long term. The question about international influences during the Cold War period, this is obviously crucial. The United States in particular, which was a democratic regime, made, I think, a variety of calculations about the importance of authoritarianism in providing stability, and was willing to trade off what appeared to be stability for democracy and its support for regimes in a wide variety of places in the world. Over the long term, this was a mistake, because the stability that these authoritarian regimes offered proved to be fairly illusory. We see this in places like Egypt today. Now, policymakers don't make decisions for generations, they make decisions for years at the most, and so one understands this calculation. But with the benefit of comparison, with the benefit of history, with our ability to sit here in a room like this and think about big questions, we can, I think, if we look carefully, understand that these trade-offs are really short-term trade-offs at the best. The stability that authoritarianism provides in a place like Egypt is not of a long-term variety. Right? Suppressing problems, not dealing with problems, suppressing or deepening cleavages does not create stability over the long term, although it may, in some superficial sense, create it over the short term. So it is absolutely the case that one cannot consider pre-third wave countries without thinking about the Cold War or international influences more generally. But again, this highlights one of the other things that I think people have not thought about carefully, both in the policy and the scholarly community, which is, again, the way legacies of previous authoritarian regimes, the nature of those regimes, the kinds of goals they ostensibly had, really shape the kinds of challenges new democracies face. And what we should understand new democracies doing to a large degree is really trying to deal with, again, the legacies or pathologies from previous authoritarian regimes. These problems are not problems of democracy, right? They're problems that new democratic regimes inherit from the past. That doesn't mean democracies don't have to deal with them, but I think we make the mistake of associating the problems with democratic weakness or democratic instability rather than we do with the large challenges involved in overcoming authoritarian pasts. Democracy promotion. Yes, I mean, every democratic wave in the past has been associated by euphoria, optimism, the belief that we are in a new age. This happened in 1789, in 1848, in 1918. It will happen next time as well. There is an inevitable process of disillusionment. This is the way the world works. And with the optimism comes a belief, by definition with optimism, that things are easy, that people can make a huge difference from the outside, that democracy promotion was simply a matter of having enough money or, studying enough, I don't know, judicial reform, legislative reform. And no, it's not that easy. Promoting democracy is not easy, not only because building democracy is largely a challenge that has to be faced by people within the countries themselves, but also because the challenges overall were much greater, I think, than people thought in the initial years following the third wave. So I think we must be very careful about what we can expect democracy promotion to produce. And I think the problem is if we're not careful and if we're not circumspect in our expectations, we're bound to be disappointed, and therefore there tends to be a backlash, right? We go from incredible optimism to belief in pessimism. We go from believing that outside actors can make a huge difference to thinking that nothing is going to matter at all. So having the right expectations, I think, will really make us better able to think about good policy rather than it should not encourage us to think that we shouldn't care about democracy or helping new democracies at all, but we should be careful in what we can expect, especially, I think, outside actors to be able to accomplish. Then some other questions from Michael, maybe I can try to address. Questions about sovereign debt. I'm not an economist. I will say, though, with regard to the German case, this is a classic example, by the way, of legacies of authoritarian regimes. The sovereign debt problem that Germany had during the Weimar Republic was largely a consequence of the previous authoritarian regime, namely that dictators are not very good at taxing their people, no taxation without representation. Germany financed its war, therefore, largely via debt, and this generated a huge number of problems during the post-war period. And so a lot of the problems in Weimar that stemmed from debt, and the Weimar Republic had more problems than we could spend an hour and a half talking about, these were, again, problems that stemmed from or had their roots in, rather, a previous authoritarian regime. Couldn't tax its citizens, had to borrow to finance the war, and left the problems of having to deal with that debt overhang in the hands of New Democrats, who, of course, got the blame for the inflation and all of the other problems that followed. I think, in general, one thing that history teaches us is that the more challenges a new regime faces, a new democratic regime in particular, the more difficult its ability to consolidate itself will be. I don't think you needed someone with a PhD to tell you that, but I think that this is an important thing that we often forget. Having to deal with an incredibly difficult economic climate, having to deal with something like a huge amount of debt, depression, whatever, this is difficult for any regime to deal with, but a regime that's also in the process of trying to build its own infrastructure, hoping to see the consolidation of political parties and civil society, trying to change the attitudes and expectations of its citizens. If it is also born in a climate of economic difficulties, yes, that's going to be a problem. And I think the history of debt crises more generally shows that without some kind of write-offs or forgiveness, these things are never overcome. So why you would want to burden new or weak democracies with these kinds of things from the perspective of the international community, I don't really understand. That seems like piling kindling on a fire that you don't want to see explode, to mix many and too many metaphors. Again, the question between economic and political liberalization, a big issue, of course, in this part of the world where countries making transitions from communism had to deal with both of these kinds of things at the same time. Again, the more challenges you give to a new regime, the more difficulties that regime is going to have. It's a tautology almost when you say it that way, but we often forget that. Perhaps the more interesting question, since that's an obvious thing, is thinking about how the nature of the economy influences the chances for consolidation. This is something, again, historically that has proven very important. It is very difficult to build stable, well-functioning democratic regimes in oligarchic capitalism, in crony capitalistic societies. We've had these kinds of things in the past. It makes it very difficult for stable, consolidated, liberal democracies to develop. And when you look at the way economic transitions happened in parts of the former communist world, you see precisely these kinds of hybrid, you might think of them as hybrid capitalist regimes. We're going to talk about hybrid political regimes later. It is very difficult for democracy to work in those kinds of economic settings. And again, while transitions from capitalism, from communism, are surely a late 20th century phenomenon, having to build democracies in these kind of hybrid capitalist regimes is not something that's new. It was absolutely the case in many European countries during the 19th and early 20th centuries, and proved to be an incredibly difficult challenge to overcome. Maybe a nice place to end would be with your last question, which is, will consolidation happen faster today? And again, I think that brings up how a comparative perspective might change the way we look at new democracies. In some ways, the international order is much more favorable for democracy than it would have been for the West European cases that I discussed that made transitions during the 19th and early 20th centuries. Not only, again, do we not have, right, a real political competitor to democracy today, but we have not only greater communications. It's very difficult to hide from people what's going on in other parts of the world. We have much more international pressure for democracy than we would have had in the past. And again, to paraphrase maybe another great scholar from this part of the world, Alexander Gerschenkron, we have the advantages of backwardness, right? We know what stable, well-functioning democracies look like. We know what they need, and one might hope, right, that we therefore, since we have historical knowledge, since we have comparative knowledge, that maybe that can help both outside and domestic actors make better decisions about what it's going to require to consolidate democracy in their countries today. So maybe the international environment is more rather than less favorable to democracy than we actually think, and we'll turn back, 50 years from now and think that this was actually an era when, in a comparative and historical perspective, democracy consolidated fairly quickly as opposed to as slowly as it had in the past.
Thank you very much for those replies. I'll come back to Andreas and Michael towards the end. I personally just wanted to push you a little bit before we open this up to other people for questions on, it really kind of links with Michael's last point about consolidated democracies, and it's the way we're using this term democracy. Because one of your statements in your reply was that suppressing problems and deepening cleavages does not create stability over the long term. Now, this, to my mind, I look currently at the incarceration rates in the United States of America, and these are just below the incarceration rates in the Soviet Union during the Stalinist period. I look at the announcement yesterday that Jeb Bush is considering running for the presidency in the United States. So we have a tradition of dynastic politics. In a country where we have no direct election for the president, only a very bizarre and antiquated system of electoral colleges, this enormous media concentration, and I won't even start on issues around surveillance. So my question is, what kind of democracy are we talking about, and what are we seeking to consolidate?
Okay, fair enough. As the punching bag for the United States, I'll try to take that one on. So this brings up a question, I think also that you raised, Michael, which is, sort of how we think about not just what consolidated democracy is, but again, whether we think of countries today like the US, North America, Western Europe, as consolidated democracies. That doesn't mean that they don't have significant problems. I mean, consolidated democracies can have a whole variety of problems. They can have a whole variety of flaws. When we talk about them being consolidated, on the most basic level, what we really mean is that they're not likely to slip back into authoritarianism. But that doesn't mean a consolidated democracy is not one without problems. And if we think of democracy as a system that has no problems, then not only would we have no democracies, but we'd be living in a sort of utopia. And I think the U.S. certainly has more than its share of problems. What democracy offers, to quote one of your great prime ministers, is it's the best compared to all the alternatives, right? So when you think about the obvious flaws in American democracy, the incarceration of many of its citizens, the tendency to elect people with the same last name over and over again, democracy provides you the ability to correct for your mistakes. Incarceration rates are truly atrocious in the United States. I mean, we deal with social problems to a large degree by throwing people in jail. There actually has been, however long overdue and however gradual, a recognition over the last couple of years that finally that this is not just a problem, but that some of the causes of this, ridiculous drug sentencing laws, disparate sentencing for different racial and social groups, that this is actually a problem. Now, I don't expect this to change dramatically in the next couple of years, but there has been, again, some recognition now, not just, by the way, among Democrats, but also among Republicans, that this is something that needs to be dealt with, and the wheels of American democracy grind awfully, awfully slowly. But you have the capacity to raise issues and to try to change them in a democratic regime that you don't, obviously, in others. And I think this is, again, a sort of trite thing to say, but it's a really important one. That capacity to sort of self-correct, to raise issues on an agenda that are not those of the dictatorial elites themselves, is one of the reasons why democracy is better than its alternatives. So I think even in a country like the United States, which has a particularly slow-moving and dysfunctional democracy, you can see some of the ways in which the system can kind of self-correct, or try to self-correct anyway.
Okay, I'm sorry, that's not to treat
No, fair enough.
United
Fair
States.
enough.
I'm British. I carry that burden
Fair
with
enough.
you.